What is it you live for? One day when I was flipping through the channels looking for something to watch, I settled on the end of a PGA tournament. And an individual who was only 21 years old won the title of this specific match. And when he was interviewed, his statement was, "I've lived my whole life for this one moment." And as the interview ended and the cameras were gone and the broadcast went away to something else, articles were written, and this memory was lost to the archive of time, never to be opened except for by a very few. I thought, what a sad thing to live your whole life for. We all live our life for certain moments, and more importantly, certain passions that achieve identities. We strive to become brilliant teachers, star athletes, and musicians. World's best mom or dad, supervisor at the factory. When people ask who we are, we say teacher, contractor, factory worker, mom or dad, lawyer, doctor, friend, pastor. Yet all these things can be lost. And even if they are not lost, there will come a day when all that glistens is no longer gold to us, and we wish for something else, something more. But what if there was an identity that we could pursue with all our hearts and never be left wanting? Something that fills up and never leaves us empty, something we could spend our whole life living for and always have more of these great moments. Now that would bring joy. Well, guess what? This identity does exist. Today we see that joy comes most often when we live for knowing Christ and showing Christ to others with Him as our identity. Joy comes when we live for knowing Christ and showing Christ to others with Him as our identity. We read a very simple and incredibly profound statement in Philippians 1:21. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul's statement is really quite extraordinary. He doesn't say to live is to plant churches, to live is to be famous, to live is to be remembered. Instead, he simply says, to live is Christ. Location, job descriptions, circumstances, none of these mattered to Paul, and they were never empty or without purpose, always full of hope, because of Paul's main focus, which was to know Christ and to show Christ in his circumstances, locations, jobs, and relationships. In Galatians 2:20, Paul states, I am crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Because Paul's main focus was pursuit of God, his identity could never be lost. Also in pursuit of God, Paul was always discovering more and more of who God was. You see, the identity of knowing and showing God is one that we can always have more of. We can always know more and show more, and there is nothing in life that can make this cease from happening. I experienced this most when I was working at a meat factory, having lost a job of preaching week to week. That was the thing that I had studied for years to do. Oftentimes when I was at the factory, I would struggle with being just a factory worker, because I'd studied for years to be a pastor. And I often told myself that I would be happy again once I was a pastor. And one day God challenged me. He said, were you always satisfied as a pastor? I said, well, most of the time for sure. He said, always? I soberly thought, realizing that there were days when I felt I was just a pastor. He then asked, when are you most consistently full? The answer was when I was sharing the gospel with my coworkers at the factory, or encouraging another believer in truth and having joy, or listening to the Bible on CD on the way to work and remembering what I had heard. When I thanked God for the beautiful view from my home and His great creation. And then I realized the moments of fullness in the pastorate were not because I was a pastor. They were the moments that I pored over the Bible, getting ready to share truth and show people how big God was, and that was exciting. It was when a prayer with someone who was grieving brought comfort because God was brought to bear on the situation through me rather than because of me. That day, I realized I was a Christian. No, I didn't just realize that I got saved, but that Christian was the core of my identity. And the more days and hours, minutes that I realize this in my life, the more fulfilling life is. Because our greatest joy is living out the fact that our chief identity is in knowing and showing God to others, regardless of occupation, relational status, or location. Our chief identity is in knowing and showing God to others, regardless of occupation, relational status, or location. So today, though we cannot end a pandemic, we can end this crisis of identity. And in this, we will find joy that does not fade and can become greater each and every day.